Welcome, Rory Lamont. Thank you very much for joining us on the Portsmouth Business School interview series. I'd be grateful if you would be able to just sort of summarise your background and current role, and then we'll get into some subjects.
Sure. Well, it's a pleasure to talk to you all, and thank you for asking me to take part in this. So, I'm currently the CPO for Hitachi Rail's business unit that is specialised in building trains and transportation infrastructure systems. So, we are one of about five major sectors within the Hitachi corporate group, which, as a corporation, we have about 300,000 employees. Within the rail business unit structure just now, we have about 13,000 employees, and those are located on every continent around the world. Within the procurement function, which I lead, we have 368 employees currently, covering a range of activities from everything from category strategies through to supply chain and logistics planning, into some transactional areas like invoice processing, material management, and supply chain planning. My background is procurement through and through, so I've been working in this field since I started about 20 years ago. My background is in oil and gas predominantly, some time in consulting, and I joined the rail industry about two and a half years ago. Some great parallels between the oil and gas world, really major project driven, sort of 10-year, certainly 7 to 10 year project life cycles from contract signature to first mobilization of the product. International supply chains with complex logistical, legal, and technical aspects to it. And I really enjoy my time. I must admit, it's really refreshing to be working in an industry that helps people day in and day out to either get to work or get to see their loved ones. So it's really good fun.
Now, Hitachi then, they play a pretty big role, don't they, in the UK rail sector
Sure.
on High Speed 1 and through now to supporting more of the franchises. Now, it'd be
Yeah.
very interesting to hear about the story of how that evolved and developed.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic story. I mean, we didn't really exist in the UK. I think so 15 years ago was really when the business started in the UK. And we're really well known for having helped with the first Shinkansen trains in Japan for the Tokyo Olympics, the first Tokyo Olympics in 1964. Previous to that, we manufactured locomotives, but again, really as a domestic company operating only in Japan. And part of the corporate strategy was to internationalize and continue to diversify the Hitachi portfolio of products. And one of the first places that we did that for rail was in Britain with the High Speed 1 project, which connected Kent into central London in support of the London Olympics in 2012. That was a project that was really driven with a leadership team in the UK, but driven out of a manufacturing base in Kasado, which is in Japan, down in the south of the main island, sort of south of Osaka, for those that understand Japanese geography well. And we actually designed the train with a Japanese engineering team. We manufactured it in a Japanese manufacturing plant, and then imported the train into the UK and did the operationalization, the creation of the maintenance base in Stratford, near where the Eurostar goes past. And we've been operating that fleet now really successfully for a number of years, almost 10 years now. The evolution for the business was quite a stark one. We went from winning that project and mobilizing it to winning a massive government-financed initiative to replace a lot of the high-speed rolling stock in the UK. And so from 10 years ago being about 65 employees in the UK, we now have almost two and a half, nearly 3,000 employees. And if you go into Paddington Station now, all of the high-speed rolling stock that is operated by GWR are the new trains that we put into production or put into operation in the past 30 months. Similarly, at King's Cross, the new high-speed trains that are working on the East Coast Main Line for LNER are all manufactured by Hitachi. And not only that, they've been manufactured from a factory that we have established in the UK. And so I think, we're here to talk about supply chain and operations and procurement and logistics. I think the thing I might try and leave with the audience is that quite often you don't actually have a blank sheet of paper when you start out on a project. You kind of inherit aspects of the supply chain that come in as either legacy parts of your organization or through customer requirements or through government requirements. But Hitachi took the bold decision to open a factory in the northeast, so it's in Newton Aycliffe near Durham, right in the heart of railway country. So it's where Stephenson's first rocket train operated, and we've taken the time to invest in the local economy and build up the infrastructure. So not just the factory and the test track, but also the local suppliers, and it's been a great journey, to be honest, and one that I'm really proud of. A lot of it was done long before I arrived, but we've gone on from originally when we started the build program in the factory, we were receiving the train body shell, so the metal tube, and a lot of the components were all coming from Japan for assembly to happen in the factory in Newton Aycliffe. And one of the things that we had to go through, and this is why I touched on inheriting a supply chain, is we went through a lot of learning on how to build well and build to great quality, but also to think about what are some of the challenges that exist when you have such a long supply chain. And a lot of those associated with manufacture we've now addressed. Okay, so from having almost in the entirety of the BOM, the bill of materials, coming from suppliers out with the UK, we've now localised 85% of that BOM by article number into UK suppliers, and that means we've probably put into the UK economy about nearly £2 billion worth now, or we certainly will have by the time the programme finishes at the end of this year. And we estimate for every pound that we spend in our direct operations, that's generating about £1.6 worth of value in the wider supply chain. And it's been a fantastic experience to go through that localization process.
Why did why did the company feel that it needed to localize?
I think there was two drivers. There was a corporate driver, which was the desire to internationalize and generate revenues from other regions than just Japan. Okay, so that was the kind of the corporate piece. From our side, there was some requirements within the contract to manufacture within the UK. So that was like the kind of the government and customer requirements that I touched on earlier on. But from a practical operations point of view, having a long supply chain does expose you to a series of risks. And I think with the current pandemic we're experiencing around the world has only gone to highlight that. When you're running a manufacturing plant for a train, it's not quite analogous to automotive. Okay, so it's not a continuous manufacturing process, but we're moving the train through a station where we complete a set of SOPs at a heartbeat of about one movement per day to meet the build plan. And we quite quickly realised that actually having a long supply chain, the logistics of moving something from Japan to the UK cost effectively means it's a kind of 2-week process. So if you have a part missing, you can't really stock for 2 weeks. I think some of the things we found quite quickly were the need for an excellent link between the manufacturing plan, the materials control team, and the procurement team. Okay, so there's a massive interdependency there. We started trying to measure line side material availability as the production plan increased, and we were kind of getting a point of view from materials management that said we think we've got 93% of materials available line side, but the feedback we were getting from the manufacturing cells was actually that number was nearer 85, and we spent a long time having to go into a really deep level of detail and a very deep improvement program to make sure that the two parts of the organization had the same view on data. And then I think knocking that back from materials to say, we've got train number 1 is about to come at the back of the factory and there's still a certain number of parts missing. So materials team, you absolutely need to be on getting those last 2-3% to allow us to sell the train. We then started to think about train 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we managed to push it out to about, I think, 3 months before the start of manufacture. And we knew whether we had the materials on order, whether the order had been confirmed by the supplier, whether the order was in the supply chain, or whether we had an issue with the order. And it was that level of granular information meant we could have the materials team placing the order if the material wasn't on order, and the procurement team working with the supplier if there was an issue with fulfillment of that order. And that's what dramatically improved the availability of materials, which allowed us to increase the indexation rate of the factory, so the rate at which we were manufacturing trains. When I joined the company, I think it's nearly 2.5 years ago, the indexation rate of the factory was about 1 to 2 trains per week. And the sort of top rate we hit was slightly above 6. So that's a tripling of the output. For the people in the class that are studying operations management, I think the beauty of the topic is it is vast, right? So we've already touched on 4 major parts, operations, supply chain, procurement, materials planning. And I think the enjoyment for me of a career in this area is you have to be able to work with engineers, with suppliers, with commercial teams, with the customer, with governments. I spend a fair amount of my time talking to the DFT in the UK, talking to BEIS, talking to some of the export arms of the government around what are the challenges, what are the things we'd like to achieve. It's a really great area to be in, and I think quite often people overlook it as a career choice or come into it by accident, but I think there's a fantastic career to be had, especially if you bring a commercial set of skills to this, so you can be in a kind of CPO, supply chain commercial role and be really helpful in customer-facing conversations and helping shape the commercials of future deals.
High-speed rail, it must be a very specialised area. So if you're bringing that factory, bringing that production site into the UK, and you're looking to increase your local content, did you have to have a strategy to develop the capability? Was it there, waiting to be used? How long did that take?
There's quite a long legacy of train building in the UK through British Rail, and then the privatisation of British Rail has kind of given rise to a number of very competent supply chain actors in the UK, and the similar patterns happen throughout Europe. So you see there's large multinationals that are very specialised in rail. It's quite typical to see multinational companies that are specialised in rail and automotive because a brake system on a train, some of the technology is quite transferable into automotive, for example. Similarly, architectural glass companies typically will do glass for automotive or transportation solutions because they're quite similar manufacturing processes, quite similar exacting engineering standards. We're really proud of the work we did with small and medium-sized companies. So I spent quite a lot of time with the manufacturing base around Teesside. We've made quite a lot of use of manufacturing capability that's helped Nissan. So obviously battery trains are quite an important new emerging area, and we've done a lot of work looking at the battery cell supply chain that automotive have, and how can we use that same supply chain, or how can we help that supply chain develop applications that are suitable for rail. I think the skills of developing a supplier don't just sit within the supply chain or procurement function. Those pieces of work where we have developed suppliers is done very closely with manufacturing. So what's the manufacture rate that we would need from a supplier of aluminium parts is one we're looking at just now. Similarly, we spend a lot of time with design, saying, okay, what is it we have to supply? And that ramp up would typically start with, if we take the aluminium example, okay, it's simple aluminium extrusions, okay, maybe 30, 40 centimeter dimension objects. And if you think about our aluminium supply chain, trains are typically not made of steel unless you're in the USA. They're made of aluminium, and those extrusions can be. I went to a supplier in China before travel got locked down, and they were extruding 26-metre long curved aluminium sections for high-speed trains. So the nose cone right the way back for the first carriage is one extrusion. And so it's unrealistic to expect suddenly just to jump from these small component parts to that level of scale. But it is, it's a joint effort, starting small and investing, giving the cash flow, giving the steady demand, which allows the supplier to develop the skills, to get comfortable with us as a customer, to prove themselves, and then that allows us then to start giving them more and more responsibility. Typically, that would be through kitting. So instead of doing, a statement of work might be to create the housing for the recording equipment for the CCTV within a train carriage. And that would have typically been, we would have bought the metal box, we would have bought the electronic equipment that goes in the metal box, and then somebody within our factory would have put the metal box into the framework, inserted the technology, completed the wiring, and then finished off the installation. The kitting conversation would say, okay, actually that's something that this supplier may be able to do for us now, so the technology would be delivered to the supplier. The supplier installs that within the metal box they've made and deliver to us one SKU that we can then just insert.
Give us a feel for the scale of your supply chain. So how many tier one suppliers would you have, and then do you have a feel for then how many layers are behind them and so on?
Yeah, it's a great question. So just to give you a kind of idea of spend, we typically in the past 12 months at the group level, so globally, we spent about £3 billion right across all of our lines of business. If I was to think about the UK supply base, there are probably 100 suppliers that we talk to on a regular basis that we see as being key to supporting ongoing manufacture. If I think about the depth of the supply chain, confidently the supply chain is 4 to 5 layers deep. And actually, really interestingly, we've done a piece of work recently using AI to try and index through our supply chain to find the nodes. Okay, so we actually know that our supply chain isn't it's a network rather than lots of distinct chains, right? And we know we have some strategic risks. Going back to the battery example, so if you think about the cathode and anode within the battery and some of the ingredients in that, they tend to all come from certain parts of the world, which are, the kind of South American. And if you look at the geopolitical risk around that, I wouldn't be super comfortable to say we have absolute assurance of supply. So starting to look at how the network comes together and where it impinges and gets, could get stuck is quite interesting. We tried to de-risk the supply chain, so we brought a lot of the Japanese commodity pieces onshore. We then started to look at the smaller items, the metal work, the interiors, the seats. But then we went through a capacity exercise. And you can imagine as you go from doing sort of 1.8 to 2 trains a week indexation, it's not too much of a challenge. When you suddenly say, I'm going to go 3 times what we were before, you need to do a capacity assessment.
So in terms of your risk, and how do you think of risk? Do you have a formal process that you've developed and evolved? Is it quite systematic? Is it dynamic or is it static in its analysis?
It was pretty basic, right? And that's where I think, I gave the example of working with production, materials management and procurement to get a kind of level of, a common view of the truth. And that worked pretty well for us and still does work really well for us. And with COVID-19 coming onto the scene, suddenly that really wasn't enough. Okay, so we moved from this kind of material availability lens on risk to one around, what's your operational risk? So I think today we're tracking about 200 suppliers globally on a weekly basis to understand whether they're producing, whether they're in a force majeure situation, whether they have a clear plan for reopening their operations, and whether they have a risk assessment in place. And I think the next evolution of that process is to talk about the financial risk. So what's the balance sheet risk and the cash flow risk that they have? Because we are working with some fairly small companies. And one of the things the leadership team and the business unit are talking about is how can we use the strength of Hitachi's balance sheet appropriately to support our supply chain to make sure that it survives, and potentially to make sure that we can come out in a stronger position than our competitors. And I think if you were to ask me what do I lose sleep about at the moment, I lose sleep about tier 3 and 4 of our supply networks, because I can't be monitoring everything, and I'm quite reliant on our supply chain partners to be astute enough to pick up where they have challenges, and then also collaborative enough to be very transparent. I think we have a challenge coming here.
So these are out in these are global, are they? This is how many countries would that represent that you're tier 3 and 4?
I think some of the great stuff, and I hope in the course you look at the technologies that are now available to help CPOs. Right, there are some fantastic AI tools that pull together bits of existing data you have in your ERP or in your data, in your corporate data. So recently we put in a spend management tool, and that takes data from the Johns Hopkins Hospital, which is tracking the global incidences of COVID at a regional, quite a granular regional level. And it also then pulls out from our SAP system the supplier record, and it correlates the supplier address.
That's quite accurate, isn't it?
So I can tell you that 95.2% of the supply base I've used in the past 12 months is located within parts of the world where we have instances of COVID. I think we refresh that data every 2 weeks. I could refresh it every day. But, for me, before having that tool, to be able to get anywhere near that calculation, I think I would be looking at 2 or 3 analysts working very hard with a lot of Excel and a lot of room for error. Whereas now I just log in and it's refreshed, every time I log in.
So is that helping you make decisions?
It paints a very clear picture for the senior executive team. So at the moment we have a COVID response meeting every week at a senior level, where we wash up the HSE response, the situation on manufacture. I now input a report on supply chain, and my opening gambit is we're still at 95.2%, right? But with the tracking of the 400 suppliers sitting underneath, I can say, we've had 2 new suppliers come back online, and we've had 2 more suppliers invoke force majeure clauses, or some of them have now come out of force majeure. It's really useful for painting a picture, which then you can bring in the more detailed specifics behind.
So there have been news stories about this early January, was it? Something like that? And is it something you kind of go, well, I'm not really concerned about that, or not thinking about it?
I think that's where I see the future role of the CPO going. And if I could talk a bit about how we're organised just now, that might help build into that topic. We have 3 major lines of business: a line of business that builds the trains, a line of business that maintains trains or infrastructure systems we've built, and then a big capital projects part of the business that will install trackside equipment, control systems, or subcontract the civil work to actually build the railway itself, as well as supply rolling stock. And we have a procurement organisation in each one of these parts of the overall team now, and they don't directly report to me. They report to me through a dotted line, and they hardline report to the COO for each one of these organisations. And I think the future role of a CPO will evolve to be more and more like that. It will be less command and control. It will be much more around bringing transparency to the cost base, outlining what the opportunities for improvement are in the supply base, being really conscious of what the internal cost structure of the business is. So if we're processing invoices and doing P2P in-house, what's the cost of that versus what's the cost that I can achieve in the market? Working really closely with the CIO on data, because the supply chain is a big source of data. And I can almost see it evolving to be a very complementary role to the chief strategy officer. So if our chief strategy officer owns the M&A agenda, he owns the kind of top level annual planning agenda, I can see that flipping quite neatly into the CPO's world, which is what's the risk in the supply chain? What risks do we need to be monitoring and then acting upon, or just monitoring? What's happening in the supply base? So, what's shifting, who's consolidating, who's localizing, who's internationalizing, and really having quite a strategic conversation alongside I think the COO, CFO, CPO kind of become the linchpin three roles to an organisation's operational heartbeat, and then plays a bit of a forward-looking visionary role on what the art of the possible might be on the cost base.
So let me ask you, let's put that in more of a historical context. So if you go back a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, what's happened to that procurement role? I mean, did the CPO exist actually, a few decades ago? And then, why the rise? Why the rise in procurement and the importance? Because what you painted there in the future was quite an amazing role, really. And a very, very important role to an organisation.
If I recycle back to starting my career in 1999 in the North Sea, I think I was really lucky to join a very mature procurement organisation at that time, right? And there was a really clear link between what the supply chain director for the North Sea was thinking and how it linked up to the business needs. And I still think a lot of organisations struggle, or procurement organisations struggle with that, and they talk to themselves in procurement jargon about things like category strategies and leverage and relationship management and all those really good procurement buzzwords that I'm sure we've read book after book after book on, right? But I think the best procurement teams that I've worked in, and certainly the one I'm leading today, it's all about the business needs. What does the business need us to be doing just now? And if you can't articulate that and you can't address that, you really aren't playing the role you should be in the organisation. And I still think a lot of procurement teams struggle to move away from, what's the rules of running a good tender? How many slides do I need in my category strategy? And I worry that we get lost, that procurement gets lost in that kind of navel gazing and too academic world, where actually it's pretty damn simple. It's like, what do we need where? Do we understand what the market's doing or could do for us? And are we being courageous enough to challenge the business on, you're saying I should just buy it, but actually there's some commercial benefit from thinking about this differently. If you get that right, I think you earn the right to then come up that strategic conversation. And that, I think, is what all CPOs should be trying to do.
Rory, objectives, Rory. What you describe, I think, is absolutely wise and sensible. It's not typically the way people in operations or procurement are measured. It's not the way their organisations see success.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile that divide, or is it a divide that's disappearing these days?
It's a good one, and I think measures and incentives are really fundamental. And we've just come out of the planning cycle for 2020, so we're just about to communicate out the top 7 initiatives of the CEO, and that's going through the sort of traditional objective setting, break it down to the CXO level, and then break it down to the the heads of, and then down and down and down. And I think more and more, if you don't have the right forums to ensure you've still got alignment as you go through the year, that objective setting exercise can be somewhat academic and not always yield the results you want. And so actually the past 2 months, a lot of my work has been around looking at what the governance structures are in our business unit and thinking, I've been given an objective from the CEO to dramatically reduce the supply chain costs in the business unit, because we've got to raise our adjusted operating profit by about 25 basis points in the next 3 years. Now, given the way we're set up, with me having indirect reporting lines over parts of the procurement organisation, and that a lot of the cost actually comes from design, if I simply as a CPO look down my organisation and cascade the most beautiful plan in the world, it's never going to work. So, I need to have a good cascade, but I need to make sure that there's a similar set of objectives sitting in the engineering line of business, in the supplier quality area of the organisation. And then more importantly, I need to be checking in that the plan we've written is being delivered, and are there risks to delivery? If there are, what changes do we need to make on sequencing, on resources, and even on the actual underlying activity we're doing? So I think planning is important. I think coordination and regular review cross-discipline is really the key. And then I think, measurement, procurement's always kind of had this measurement by savings, and I think that's good. I sort of look more and more about how sales is measured, right? So, sales look at the velocity of the sales funnel. And I think there's probably something in procurement to think about in that area. How many ideas can we generate with the business and with our partners? How many of those ideas get converted into things that the senior management think are good and they fund? And then how long does it take you to convert those? And then can the CFO really see it in the bottom line? If you start thinking in that way and nick some of the thinking from our sales and business development colleagues, I think that's a really smart way to push the supply chain and push the commercials of your business.
So with something like product innovation, if that's brought from your supply base, is that captured at the moment?
I think that's an area we're working on, and it's sometimes difficult to get that balance between allowing suppliers the opportunity to talk to you and having engineers that are at the right cycle in the design, or the right point in the design cycle to listen. And it's interesting, one of the things we've been battling with is the sales cycle for new rolling stock projects is getting dramatically squeezed, to the point where we might have, say, 6 to 8 weeks to respond to a clarification or to even an initial brief. And to go through an innovation cycle within that is really difficult. And so that's where I think procurement's got to play the role of provoking that conversation outside the sales cycle. So we know that if we know the trend in the market is for pricing to reduce, what options can we generate? If we know that on more and more rolling stock projects, it's an NPV, a net present value calculation that's based around weight, energy consumption, noise, and track damage. Right. So if we know those are the 4 big things for us, what are the category managers doing to start to disseminate that information in the supply chain and get it brought into our organisation in a way that it comes at the right time?
So how do you invite that? How do you spur your suppliers to come and volunteer ideas? Do you run workshops with them, conferences with them? What is the approach there?
I think that's something we've still got to get right. Some of the steps we took last year, we did a virtual supplier day where we had the CEO, myself, and the COOs talk for an hour online about what the strategy for the company was. We'd just done a restructure, so we talked about the new structure of the company. This year we'll repeat that exercise, but instead of having the COOs who run the operations, we'll have the head of sales for each region talking about what areas are we trying to geographically expand into, what's the product range going to shift to. So, I can cover, I think we had 1,000 people participate in that webcast, so you can push that message really hard. I think then you need to follow that up with, really listening to the sales guys. Okay, so it's really about lightweight structures for the Indian market. Okay, so if it's lightweight structures in India, we need to be talking to aluminium suppliers with capability in or around India. Okay, so that's a very specific category manager supplier identification task. Passenger information systems are getting more and more complex within our trains. So it's about being able to not just say this seat's free, but also maybe what's the availability of Boris bikes at the point of arrival, or what's happening on bus routes. So we're trying to communicate that back into our partners and say, how can you help us give a more richer information environment on the train? And by the way, your systems use loads of wiring, and wiring takes us ages to install, and it's really easy to mess up when you install it. So can you help us kit? Yes or no? And can you give us a richer environment for our customers? Or we've even gone to the point of talking to some of our, bringing some of our customers to talk with our engineers, to talk with that systems provider. But it is not, it's not just simply pumping stuff out. It's a kind of top level dissemination with quite individual follow-ups, either by the category manager or by joint supplier engineer, and then procurement teams on specific.
The relationships you have with suppliers. Tell us about the kind of contracts. Are you spot buying some things? Are you having transactional relationships? What are the long-term relationships? What are the shape of these relationships?
It's quite interesting having recently changed industry, and I think oil and gas. Some of the things I observed in oil and gas were some quite well-developed account management approaches. So I'd say for anybody who's studying operations, it's really worthwhile taking some time to look at, kind of transactional sales management, strategic sales management, key account or strategic account, and understanding how that structure works. And I think the thing I observe is that it's still quite a relationship-based way of selling. So our contracts are long-term, right? So they will be multi-year, and typically they are for the duration of a build program. So there's an enduring relationship outside a train manufacturing program, right? But it's not formalized in a memorandum of understanding that you might see in aerospace or automotive. And the contracts don't typically involve performance incentives, because actually, it's about availability of the system at the point of installation. There are a couple of exceptions, all right. So the generator unit which we buy in, we have a fairly complex set of KPIs around how that should perform, and we really contract manage quite hard that particular system. But there's definitely room to move that forward. So if you think about the same supplier that provides the generator unit for our train, also has a very large part of its business in the aerospace sector. Now, if anybody's looked at the aerospace sector, it's really interesting to look at how they contract for the turbines that fly the planes. And so there is definitely room to progress, but it's about the maturity of our business and the readiness of the supplier to move down that road with us.
Oh, are you talking about things like power by the hour philosophy?
Absolutely.
Do those structures, do those approaches you're using, do you think they encourage innovation?
I'm not always sure a contract is what encourages innovation, right? I think it can. If I think about where I've seen things move really quickly in the supply chain, it's where our customers say, we really, really want this from you. And then that gets us quite focused because there's a commercial opportunity there. Or, I've seen some great innovation recently around PPE. Because of the shortage of PPE, we've had some really serious conversations about, we've got space in our factories. Manufacturing this ourselves is possible. Do we want to do it? So I think it's more about the incentives being right for the people in the supply chain, and it is about having a very comprehensive contractual arrangement. I think that's what tends to come as a result of 3, 4, 5, 6 successful projects being delivered between two companies.
So if you were a great member of your procurement team, there's a lot of things that you're being asked to do, really. Have great relationships with your suppliers, encourage innovation, find new things. What is the kind of person then that goes into these roles?
I think some of the best people we have come up and through materials. They've been in a materials planning scenario, so they understand the importance of having the right contract and PO in place and how that works within an MRP or works within an ERP. And then they kind of grow into contracting. And then with that really solid basis, it's quite a natural step to start thinking more strategically about what's the supply chain capable of. We have some people who've come from a sales background, who then flip into procurement and tend to be the ones that succeed well in more complex and intertwined relationships, where we've got a piece of kit installed for a long time, like the last example. There's a whole sort of different side to procurement, and that's the process, tools, technology side. And so I think what I would say is there's actually a lot of room within supply chain procurement for very many different profiles. I think, as I said, with CPO of the future, the CPO's office of the future will be much more data-driven and analytical. So, at the moment, trying to find analytical skills isn't difficult, but trying to find analytical skills that have a bent towards thinking about the supply chain rather than thinking about deal commercials. That takes a bit of persuasion sometimes too.
So you're in a very engineering environment. Would you need a degree in engineering?
I don't think so. I think you need to have a good pair of ears. You're prepared to listen and get stuck in. That's probably what's more important than an engineering degree. Certainly, some of the guys that are working on some of the key systems, they are ex-engineers, right? And it does help. But I wouldn't let that hold you back. I don't have an engineering degree, and I've been working in technical discipline procurement from day one.
Well, this sort of leads us into an interesting question about, imagine now you're talking to our undergraduates or even postgraduate doing a course, and you were just giving them suggestions or guidance. Here they are in this situation. Here we are in a very strange situation at the moment. And thinking about how they should think about the future and so on. What guidance would you impart to them?
I think it's pretty standard advice I give to a lot of people that work with me. Some of my mentors passed this down to me over the years, but kind of plan in 3-year blocks, right? Because that's probably about as far forward as you can plan, right? And know that whatever plan you have is probably not the one that's going to happen. Early on in your career, I think, do not be afraid to try different things, and especially if you have this kind of operations qualification. As I said, there's 4 really big areas to get into. Supply chain, so the physical movement of goods; materials planning, what do we need and when; procurement, and then the strategic relationship side of procurement. If you can spend a bit of time in the first 5 to 6 years of your career across all of those domains, that really sets you up very well for what might come later. If I was coming into the job market just now, I would be really looking at my network and trying to develop a network of people that I could talk to, and try and find an opportunity to really just go out and experience what the supply chain actually means. And a great place to do that is on the shop floor. If you can actually get in to a manufacturing situation where you've got to help manufacture a product, great. You can get into a sales situation where you're trying to understand customers' needs and translate that back into your organization. It's very analogous to trying to talk to our engineers and translate that into something that a supplier can make for us. I think international experience is really important. It's not always easy to get. So I think if you can find an organization where you're having to work with different cultures, even if that is a domestic organization, that's really helpful. I work in an organization that's Japanese, has a large amount of Italian people in it, and a large amount of Brits, and that's 3 very different cultures to work across. So candidates that have got a good sort of 6 years varied experience within operations are great, and people that have an appreciation of different cultures is great. So that would be my advice: is get a grounding across many disciplines, try and get it in an international culture, a mix of cultures, and if you can find a way to do a bit of work abroad, even if it is just for business trips, I think that's great as well.
Well, thank you very much, Rory Lamont. That's been an excellent interview. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.